Well, as you read through the New Testament, you can't miss the massive emphasis that is given to prayer in the life of the church. And as we're going through our Jesus-centered life term on the Holy Spirit, you don't have to read the Bible for very long before you see that one of the things the Spirit desperately wants to do in the life of a church is to bring us together through Jesus and to the Father, to come as a church before the throne of grace. That is something that is so important to the Spirit. And a church that is filled with the Spirit, a church that is in step with the Spirit, will be a church that gives huge emphasis to prayer as individuals, but corporately as a church. And that's really important. Not just a few people, for whom prayer it's their thing, but as a church, it's part of our identity as the people of God. Is we are a people who come together in prayer. I think we see that sort of emphasis in the scriptures. We see it in the history of the church as well. I'm putting a series of videos together for you during this series, looking at revivals. Times when the Spirit really does sort of take hold of a church and he has his way with it. And he does get to structure the life of the church in the way that he wants to. Now, one of the things that I'll bring out in that little series of videos on revival is that in revival, nothing fundamentally different happens in the experience of the church. It's just that all the different component parts of a healthy church's spiritual life are massively intensified. So it's not like, okay, in revival the church does evangelism. No, the church always does evangelism. It's just that in revival, evangelism becomes much more significant and much more effective and powerful in terms of people's responding to it. And similarly, it's not that, the church doesn't pray except in times of revival. No. A healthy church, a church that is in step with the Spirit, will always be praying. But in revival, prayer becomes a dominating feature in the life and the experience of the church. Now, I suspect that we, at some instinctive level, we know that prayer is massively important in the life of the church. And we know that if our church was led by the Spirit, prayer would be a massively important part of what we do together as the people of God. And I suspect we're not at all surprised to learn that in the Bible there is this massive emphasis on prayer, and that the apostles, these guys who are inspired by the Spirit of God, are constantly calling the church and leading the church into prayer together. Now, perhaps the most challenging verse in the Bible about this is when Paul's writing to the church at Thessalonica. And in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, he says, pray continually. Okay? Now, verse 18, he goes on to say, give thanks in all circumstances. And then verse 19, he talks about not quenching the Spirit. So you see immediately, as is so often the case in the Bible, the deep connectedness between the church at prayer and the ministry of, the life of the Spirit, and the Spirit having his way with the people of God. Pray continually, don't quench the Spirit. Now, here's the problem, though, with 1 Thessalonians 5:17, is that when we read that verse, pray continually, I think there's a real danger that we default to the kind of individualism that is so embedded, so much part of the atmosphere of our culture. All right, we are, in Britain at the minute, we're just taught and trained to think and to see ourselves individualistically. And there's a real danger that we bring that to the reading of the Bible. So we read 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17, and we think, oh, Paul is talking to me as an individual. Paul is telling me as an individual Christian, he is telling me that I must pray continually. Now, like, how would you do that? You know, what would that look like? And I think people have tried to resolve this in one of two ways. One is they sort of want to try to turn everything into prayer. Well, if I'm supposed to pray continually, then everything must in some way be able to become an act of prayer. Well, that may or may not be the case. I don't think that's what Paul's doing in 1 Thessalonians 5:17. More often, when we read 1 Thessalonians 5:17 as an individualistic thing, more often what happens is we sit back and we think, no, that's ridiculous. That can't be done. Paul must be exaggerating. That's Paul's exaggerating. He doesn't actually mean that we should pray continually. He just means that, we should pray quite a bit. And so we sort of give ourselves a pass in a way on that and think, well, obviously I don't have to pray continually. I just need to make sure that periodically and maybe even systemically prayer is a feature of my life. There's a problem with that though, right? And the problem is Paul actually does say pray continually. So how do we make sense of that? Well, I think the thing to realize is Paul is not writing to an individual. He's writing to the church at Thessalonica, the congregation or maybe several congregations in a region of Greece. And he's writing to the church. And he's saying to the church, you should pray continually. All right? As an apostle, as this guy who is uniquely inspired by the Holy Spirit, his teaching is reflecting so perfectly what the Spirit longs to develop and cultivate in the life of the church. And he said that one of the things the Spirit wants to be doing here is to lead you as a church to be a people who are praying continually. And let me say this, I don't think he's exaggerating for effect. I don't think he's overstating his case to kind of make a point. Well, I think he means that prayer is something that a church should be doing continually, like all the time. And not just like every time they come together for a service or even just a prayer meeting. But no, actually pray continually. It's something that is planned for. It's something that's built into the structures and the life of the people of God. It's a constant and continuous expression of prayer that in a church there should always be people praying for the mission and for the ministry of that church. And actually, that's not as crazy as it sounds. In fact, it has quite often been the experience of the church. And the times when churches have really taken that seriously and recognized that is something the Spirit wants to lead them into and have responded to that, and as the people of God have committed themselves to being a church that is continually praying, the spiritual growth and impact of the life of the church just changes exponentially. Let me just give you a couple of examples. The Moravian Church, it was part of what we would now call Germany, and it was a church, a denomination, or a movement that was throughout a region that was then known as Saxony. In 1727, the Moravian Church commenced around the clock. Well, they called it a prayer watch, I guess, based on, when Jesus tells the disciples to watch and pray. So they're like, okay, we're going to do that. And they started a prayer meeting, a prayer vigil, like a tag team prayer approach to prayer that continued non-stop for over 100 years. The church prayed continually for over a century. And the impact on church mission that the Moravian Church had was phenomenal. That on average, for a century, the Moravian Church was sending out a cross-cultural missionary every 4 months. All right? And it's not just something in history. You know, it's easy, 1727. That was a whole different world, right? Well, it's happening in the world today. The largest church, single congregation in the world is a church in South Korea. And the life of that church is focused on a thing called Prayer Mountain. Now, the origins of this, again, go back into history. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the church in South Korea was facing huge opposition from Buddhism and Confucianism. And they could, the church was pretty oppressed. And so in order to pray, Christians would get up during the night and the early hours of the morning, and they'd head up the mountains away from the villages, away from the towns. They'd head up the mountains so that they could cry out and supplicate their God. And out of that heritage has come this thing, Prayer Mountain, which is, it's a mountain. And this mountain is like dedicated to the continual praying of the church. There are facilities on this mountain for 10,000 people to be there praying at once. Some in large auditoriums, smaller rooms for groups of people, or just like individual prayer cells where you just walk in and it's literally, there's a door, you walk in, there's a room, it's big enough for you to lie down in or kneel down in, and there's a light and there's a map, and that's it. And you go in, you shut the door, and you cry out to God in there. And there are people on that mountain praying all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, constant, continual prayer. And today, in countries like, regions like North Africa, places where we often think of the church as being persecuted, you will often find this deep commitment to continual prayer, where the people from the church are in an orchestrated, planned way. They are constantly, somebody from the church or people from the church are always praying, all day, every day, all night, every night. This vigil of continual prayer. And they'll often call for special seasons of prayer and fasting as well, but underpinning that is the church is continually at prayer, often for years and years at a time. We look at churches elsewhere in the world, and we see their effectiveness in evangelism, and we see their capacity to remain faithful to Christ in the face of often extraordinary levels of persecution and suffering. And we're amazed at that, and we're inspired by that, and we're encouraged by that, and we wish we were like that. But actually what we don't see so readily is the foundation on which all that is built, which is a church that is praying continually, literally praying continually. And their effectiveness in evangelism and their capacity to stand strong through the storm is born out of their life of prayer, the prayer that the Spirit has led them into. It might sound strange, almost fantastic to our ears, but instinctively we know, don't we? We know the Spirit is at work in such movements.